Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was never one to follow the rules, especially not the ones imposed by religion. Born in the Deep South in the early 1900s, she was raised in a strict Southern Baptist household, where faith was expected to be the foundation of life. But even as a child, Bankhead rejected the idea of a divine overseer. She was drawn to the stage, to excess, to a life that defied every expectation placed upon her. By the time she became a Broadway sensation in the 1920s, she had already shed any pretense of religious devotion. Instead, she embraced a philosophy of self-reliance, believing that if she was going to survive the brutal world of fame, it would be by her own will, not by the grace of God. Her career flourished, but her personal life was a storm of indulgence and rebellion. She drank heavily, engaged in scandalous love affairs, both with men and women, and made no apologies for any of it. To her, the idea of sin was a fabrication, a tool used to control people. She openly mocked religious hypocrisy, calling out those who preached morality while indulging in their own vices behind closed doors. Her sharp tongue and fearless attitude made her both admired and feared in Hollywood and theater circles. Even as she aged and the spotlight dimmed, Bankhead never wavered in her beliefs. Unlike many stars who sought solace in faith as their careers declined, she remained steadfast in her atheism. She believed life was meant to be lived fully, without guilt, without fear of divine punishment. When she passed away in 1968, she left behind a legacy of fearless independence, a woman who refused to be tamed by religion or society. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was the face of Hollywood's golden age gangster. His steely glare, clipped speech, and larger-than-life presence made him an icon of crime cinema. But off-screen, Robinson was a man of deep intellect, drawn not to the absolutes of religious doctrine, but to the fluid, ever-questioning world of philosophy. Born in the early 1890s to a Jewish family in Romania, his upbringing exposed him to faith, but it never took root. As he pursued his career in Hollywood, he carved out his own moral compass, one built on human reasoning rather than divine command. While his characters often wrestled with questions of right and wrong in the shadows of the criminal underworld, Robinson himself believed that morality was a human construct, shaped by intellect and society, not by the hand of a higher power. His secularism wasn't just personal, it became political. During the McCarthy era, Hollywood turned into a battleground of ideology, and Robinson found himself caught in the crossfire. His progressive views, including his rejection of religious dogma, made him a target. He was blacklisted, his career nearly destroyed by accusations of communist sympathies. Though he eventually cleared his name, the experience left scars. Yet, through it all, his skepticism remained unshaken. Until his passing in the early 1970s, Robinson stood firm in his belief that the world was shaped by human action, not divine intervention. In an era when faith was often intertwined with patriotism and morality, Robinson was a rare figure, an actor who played men of conviction on screen while holding steadfast to his own convictions in real life, without the need for gods or higher powers. Luis Buñuel. Luis Buñuel was a filmmaker who didn't just reject religion. He mocked it with razor-sharp satire. Born in the year 1900 into a strict Catholic household in Spain, Buñuel was expected to embrace faith, but instead he turned against it. By his youth, he had become a staunch atheist, seeing religion as a tool of control rather than a source of truth. His films like Viridiana and The Milky Way tore into religious hypocrisy, exposing the contradictions and absurdities he saw in organized faith. He once quipped, "Thank God I'm an atheist," a line that summed up his irreverent approach. His work didn't just spark debate, it ignited outrage. Viridiana was banned in Spain for its subversive take on Catholicism, and the Vatican condemned his films for their blasphemous themes. But he never apologized. He believed art should provoke, challenge, and dismantle illusions, especially those imposed by religious institutions. Until his death in 1983, he remained unwavering in his atheism, proving that cinema could be a weapon against dogma. John Huston. John Huston was a man who lived for the grand adventure, both on and off the screen. Born in the early 1900s, he grew up in a household steeped in religion, but faith never took hold of him. Instead, he found his truth in the grit of human resilience, the raw edge of morality, and the chaos of fate. His films reflected this deep skepticism, often stripping away any notion of divine intervention and leaving his characters to wrestle with their own choices and consequences. Huston once remarked that he saw no evidence for God, a belief that shaped the very foundation of his work. In an industry where religious themes were often woven into the fabric of storytelling, he never hesitated to challenge them. His films, from The Treasure of the Sierra Madre to The Man Who Would Be King, were less about destiny and more about the unpredictable and indifferent forces of the world. Even as he aged, his stance never wavered. He remained a committed atheist until his final days in the late 1980s. For Houston, life was not about waiting for divine guidance. It was about carving out meaning in the face of an indifferent universe. Lillian Hellman. Lillian Hellman was never one to follow the script, especially when it came to faith. Born in the early 1900s to a Jewish family in New Orleans, she grew up surrounded by religious tradition but never embraced it. From an early age, she saw religion less as a source of comfort and more as a means of control. As she carved out her place in the literary world, her skepticism only deepened. Her plays, sharp and unflinching, often pulsed with themes of doubt, corruption, and the dangers of blind faith. Hellman wasn't just an atheist, she was a fiercely political one. Her leftist ideals led her to view organized religion as a tool wielded by the powerful to suppress dissent. And she didn't just keep these views to herself. She spoke out, wrote about them, and refused to conform even when it cost her. During the McCarthy era, when the US government was hunting down suspected communists, Hellman was blacklisted for her political beliefs. She could have recanted, could have softened her stance, but that wasn't her style. She famously declared that she would not cut her conscience to fit this year's fashions. That defiance defined her until the very end. When she passed in the 1980s, she left behind a legacy, not just of groundbreaking theater, but of unwavering commitment to reason and justice over dogma. In a world that often demanded faith, Lillian Hellman stood firm in her refusal to bow to anything but her own convictions. James Whale. James Whale was a man who built nightmares on screen, but in real life he feared neither God nor the societal constraints that tried to define him. Born in the late 19th century into a working-class English household steeped in Christian tradition, Whale was expected to follow the faith that surrounded him. But the horrors of World War I shattered any illusions of a benevolent deity. As a soldier, he witnessed firsthand the brutality of war, the senseless loss of life, and the sheer randomness of survival. If there was a God, Whale saw no evidence of his mercy on the battlefield. That disillusionment stayed with him for the rest of his life. Despite his rejection of religion, Whale's films often wrestled with themes of creation, morality, and divine punishment. His most famous work, Frankenstein, is steeped in the idea of man playing God, but Whale saw the story not as a cautionary tale about divine wrath, but as a tragedy of human cruelty. The monster, abandoned and misunderstood, was not an abomination in Whale's eyes. He was a victim. Many have speculated that Whale, as an openly gay man in an era that demanded silence, saw himself in the creature. Just as the monster was cast out by society, Whale had to navigate an industry and a world that often refused to accept him. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Whale never hid who he was. He lived openly as both an atheist and a gay man, defying the rigid moral expectations of Hollywood's golden era. While others in the industry carefully curated public personas that aligned with mainstream religious and social values, Whale refused to conform. His defiance came at a cost. His career in Hollywood faded as studios became less willing to work with someone so unapologetically himself. But Whale never sought redemption in faith, nor did he express regret for his choices. Until his death in the late 1950s, he remained steadfast in his belief that meaning was not found in religion, but in art, in creation, and in the freedom to live without fear. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was a man who built entire worlds with his voice, his vision, and his defiance of convention. But one world he never subscribed to was one governed by a higher power. Born in the early 20th century, Welles was raised in a household where art was sacred, but religion was not. His mother, a pianist and suffragist, encouraged his creativity but never imposed religious doctrine. His father, a free-spirited inventor, leaned toward agnosticism. This early environment gave Welles an unshakable belief in human ingenuity over divine intervention. From an early age, Welles was drawn to the works of Shakespeare and the great philosophers, immersing himself in ideas that questioned the nature of existence. He saw the gods of literature and history as human constructs, tools used to shape narratives rather than dictate reality. This skepticism carried into his career, where he masterfully wove religious themes into his films, not as expressions of faith, but as explorations of power, myth, and human folly. Perhaps the most telling example of his complex relationship with religion was his proposed film on the life of Christ. Wells sought guidance from religious leaders, insisting he would portray Christ with reverence using only scriptural dialogue. Yet his approach was met with resistance. Some church figures doubted his sincerity, while others feared his interpretation would be too human, too devoid of divine mystery. In truth, Wells was less interested in faith and more fascinated by the stories faith created. Throughout his life, Wells engaged in debates on religion, challenging the notion that morality and creativity required divine inspiration. He believed in the power of intellect, the force of human will, and the artistry of storytelling. Until his death in the mid-1980s, he remained steadfast in his conviction. The greatest cathedrals, the most enduring myths, and the most profound truths were not handed down from the heavens. They were built by human hands, carved from human minds. Douglas Sirk. Douglas Sirk's films dripped with lush colors and grand emotions, but beneath the melodrama lay a sharp critique of the world he left behind. Born in Germany in the late 1800s, he was raised in a Lutheran household, yet faith never truly took root in him. As a young man, he abandoned religion entirely, disillusioned by what he saw as its contradictions. But it was the rise of the Nazi regime that cemented his atheism. Sirk fled Germany, witnessing firsthand how religion was weaponized for political control, twisted into a tool of oppression rather than salvation. That cynicism bled into his films. His Hollywood melodramas, like Magnificent Obsession and Imitation of Life, were often mistaken for sentimental morality tales, but beneath their glossy surfaces they exposed the suffocating grip of societal and religious expectations. His characters were trapped, not just by fate, but by the rigid structures of belief imposed upon them. Though his films often brushed against religious themes, Sirk himself dismissed the idea of divine intervention. To him, suffering and redemption were human struggles, not celestial decrees. Until his final days, in the late 1980s, he remained firm in his belief that people shape their own destinies. Not God's, not fate, just choices. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison was the epitome of charm on screen, effortlessly slipping into roles that often carried a sense of grandeur, authority, or even divine wisdom. But off-camera, the man behind Professor Henry Higgins and Julius Caesar had no patience for the idea of a higher power. Born in early 20th century England, Harrison grew up in an Anglican household. Yet as he matured, he found himself increasingly skeptical of religious doctrine. His razor-sharp wit and intellect made him a natural skeptic, and he often dismissed religious beliefs as relics of a bygone era, clinging to reason and humanism instead. Despite portraying historical and even religious figures on screen, Harrison never wavered in his personal stance. He saw faith as an outdated construct, a crutch that people leaned on rather than confronting the realities of existence. His personal letters and interviews revealed a man who placed his trust in intellect and human capability rather than divine intervention. He believed that life should be lived in the present, not in anticipation of an afterlife. And while many of his contemporaries kept their skepticism quiet to avoid controversy, Harrison remained steadfast in his views until his passing in the final decade of the 20th century. His legacy as a performer is undeniable, but his personal philosophy remains a fascinating contrast to the roles he played. While he could bring to life the grandeur of a king, or the conviction of a scholar, Rex Harrison himself never bowed to any higher force, only to the power of reason. Joseph Cotten. Joseph Cotten was the kind of leading man who exuded quiet strength and moral certainty on screen, but behind the camera his convictions told a different story. Born in the early 20th century, Cotten was raised in a deeply religious household, where faith was not just a personal belief but a way of life. Yet as he stepped into the world of Hollywood, a place brimming with new ideas and perspectives, his childhood faith began to loosen its grip. He found himself drawn not to divine doctrine, but to the philosophy of secular humanism, a belief system that placed human reason and ethics above religious dogma. Despite playing characters that often embodied traditional values, Cotten himself rejected the idea of divine intervention. He saw morality as an intrinsic human trait, not something dictated by a higher power. This perspective only solidified as he navigated the complexities of fame and the ever-changing tides of the film industry. Unlike some of his contemporaries who loudly declared their disbelief, Cotten remained understated but firm in his views. He did not seek to challenge religion outright, but he lived as a quiet testament to the idea that goodness and integrity could exist entirely separate from faith. Until his passing in the early 1990s, Cotten never wavered from his secular convictions. He was a man who believed in kindness, in reason, and the power of human connection, without the need for divine oversight. In an era when Hollywood often leaned into grand religious narratives, Cotten stood apart. proving that a leading man could leave faith behind and still be guided by an unwavering moral compass. Jean Renoir. Jean Renoir was born in the late 19th century into a world of color, texture, and artistic rebellion. His father, the legendary painter Pierre-Auguste Renoir, filled their home with canvases, not catechisms. Religion was never a cornerstone of his upbringing. Art was. Raised in a secular environment, Renoir developed a worldview that placed human experience and responsibility above divine intervention. His films reflected this philosophy, weaving stories of flawed, complex individuals, navigating a world where fate was not preordained but shaped by their choices. Unlike many of his contemporaries who saw the chaos of 2 world wars as proof of a higher power's wrath or mercy, Renoir remained steadfast in his belief that humanity, not divinity, dictated the course of history. He saw no grand cosmic plan, only the intricate dance of human nature. His films, from The Rules of the Game to Grand Illusion, rejected the idea of destiny, instead portraying a world where people, not gods, determined their fate. Even as he aged, Renoir held firm to his conviction that compassion and creativity were the true forces of good. Until his passing in the late 20th century, he remained a champion of humanism, proving that one could find meaning, beauty, and morality without the need for divine oversight. Lionel Barrymore. Lionel Barrymore was born into a dynasty of actors, but his early life was shaped just as much by religion as it was by the stage. Raised in a devout household, he was steeped in the traditions of faith, yet as he grew older, the grandeur of religious belief began to feel more like a script than a truth. His struggles with chronic illness only deepened his skepticism. If there was a divine plan, why did it seem so indiscriminate in its cruelty? Barrymore, ever the iconoclast, found more comfort in the tangible world of storytelling and human connection than in the abstract promises of an afterlife. Ironically, he often portrayed religious figures on screen, slipping into the robes of faith for the sake of performance. But off-camera, he made no secret of his disbelief. He once remarked that he had no use for God, finding far more solace in the company of fellow artists and the fleeting truths of the stage. To him, life was not a prelude to something greater. It was the main act, the only act, and he intended to play it to the fullest. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.